and honestly thought I'd seen everything nature could throw at me. My supervisor, old Frank Garrison, used to joke that I knew every pothole and washout from Whitefish to the Canadian border. That particular Monday started like any other winter call-out. Just me and the company F-350, heading up to inspect Line 47 after the Weather Service reported 60-mile-per-hour winds the night before. Nobody else wanted the route, because it meant 4 hours of driving through nowhere just to check if some cables were still hanging where they should be. But the solitude never bothered me. At 37, after a messy custody battle that left me seeing my daughter every other weekend, those long drives gave me time to think without my apartment walls closing in. What strikes me now, thinking back, is how many locals tried to warn me without actually warning me. When I stopped at the Conoco station at the base of Copper Ridge Road to fuel up and grab coffee, the kid behind the counter, couldn't have been older than 19, asked which route I was taking up the mountain. I told him I'd follow the service road past Miners Creek, and his whole expression changed, like someone had walked across his grave. He started to say something, stopped, then just muttered that I should make sure I had chains and extra supplies. Even Nancy at dispatch seemed weird when I radioed in my position around noon, kept asking if I wanted to wait until tomorrow when they could send a 2-man crew. But the forecast showed another system moving in by Wednesday, and if those lines came down, half of Glacier County would lose power. So I kept driving, watching the sky turn that peculiar gray-white that means serious snow is coming, completely unaware that by nightfall I'd understand why everyone who grew up in those mountains knew better than to travel that particular stretch of road alone. The accident happened around 3 in the afternoon, though accident isn't really the right word for what went down. I was navigating a particularly narrow section, where the service road hugs the cliff face, snow already falling heavy enough that I had to lean forward to see through the windshield. The truck's thermometer read -12, and even with the heater blasting, ice was forming on the inside corners of the windows. I just passed the old Forest Service marker, maybe mile 17 from the highway, when I saw what looked like a fallen tree branch across the road. Standard procedure says to radio it in before getting out to clear obstacles, but the static on my handset was so bad, I figured I'd move it first, then report when I hit a clearer spot. I stopped the truck, put it in park, grabbed my work gloves from the dash. That's when the steering wheel jerked hard to the right, like something had yanked it, and the whole vehicle started sliding sideways toward the drop-off. Physics is funny when you're on ice. Everything happens fast and slow at the same time. The F-350 weighs close to 7,000 pounds, and once it starts moving laterally on a slope, nothing's going to stop it. I remember pumping the brakes, useless on that glassy surface, while the passenger side tilted down toward a ravine I knew dropped at least 40 feet. The truck caught on something, probably a boulder under the snow, and flipped halfway before slamming into a cluster of pines about 20 feet down from the road. The impact threw me hard against the driver's door, and I heard the crack before I felt it, my left ankle folding in a way ankles aren't supposed to fold. The engine died immediately, that sudden silence after chaos that makes your ears ring. Snow was already pouring through the shattered passenger window, and I could smell hot metal and leaking fluids. My first coherent thought was about the satellite emergency beacon in my vest pocket, the one the company made us carry after a lineman died of exposure in 2016. My second thought, as I tried to move and pain shot up my leg like someone had driven railroad spikes through the bone, was that I was completely, utterly screwed. Getting the beacon activated took me almost 20 minutes. Every movement sent white-hot agony through my ankle, and I had to stop twice just to keep from passing out. The little LED showed it was transmitting, but the signal strength indicator kept fluctuating between 1 and 2 bars, sometimes dropping to nothing. Best case scenario, dispatch would get my distress signal and coordinates within the hour. Realistic scenario, with the storm getting worse and the weak transmission, maybe 3 or 4 hours. Search and rescue would need at least another 2 hours to reach me after that, assuming they could even navigate the road in these conditions. I managed to drag myself partially out of the truck to assess the situation, and that's when things started getting genuinely weird. The F-350 had left a clear path through the snow, where it went off the road, but about 10 feet from where I'd stopped, I could see my own boot prints in the fresh powder, walking in a circle around the truck. Except I hadn't gotten out of the vehicle before it went over the edge. These were fresh tracks, maybe 30 minutes old based on how little snow had filled them in, and they were definitely from my Red Wing work boots, same distinctive tread pattern, same size. I told myself someone must have stopped to help, seen the truck go over, maybe walked around looking for the best way down. But that didn't explain why the prints matched my boots exactly, or why they just circled the truck without approaching it. Using the door frame, I pulled myself up enough to look around properly, and that's when I spotted the cigarette butts. 5 of them, stamped out and half buried in the snow near where the truck had stopped on the road above. Marlboro Reds, the gold band still visible on one. Here's what made my chest tighten. I don't smoke, never have, but more importantly, those butts were under fresh snow that had fallen after my crash. Someone had stood there smoking, watching my truck for at least 20 or 30 minutes after the accident. Long enough to finish multiple cigarettes. Long enough to walk down and around my vehicle. Long enough to help, but they didn't. They just watched. I tried the radio again. Got nothing but static that seemed to pulse in a rhythm that almost sounded like breathing. The rational part of my brain said it was just atmospheric interference from the storm. But rationality becomes flexible when you're injured and alone with evidence that someone stood there watching you suffer. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared behind the mountains, which happens around 4 in the winter up there. I needed to prepare for a long night, possibly my last if things went wrong. The truck's emergency kit was still intact, thank God. Thermal blanket, flares, first aid supplies, 2 bottles of water, some energy bars. I managed to wrap my ankle using gauze and an instant cold pack, though the swelling was already so bad I couldn't get my boot off. That's when I decided to check under the hood for the tow strap we keep coiled near the battery, thinking I could maybe use it to secure myself better in the tilted cab. I dragged myself around to the front of the truck, using the bumper and grille for support, popped the hood latch from inside, then pushed it open. The strap was gone, but not just missing, cut clean through where it attached to the frame. The edges were fresh, no rust or wear, sliced with something sharp like a knife or heavy-duty wire cutters. Someone had deliberately removed my ability to get pulled out if another vehicle happened by. My brain kept trying to find innocent explanations, but the evidence was stacking up in a way that made my skin prickle with more than just cold. Night in those mountains is absolute in a way most people never experience. No light pollution, no distant glow from towns, just complete darkness broken only by the snow reflecting what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. By 6 o'clock, I couldn't see my hand in front of my face without the flashlight. I'd positioned myself in the driver's seat, leg elevated on the center console, thermal blanket wrapped tight, trying to conserve body heat and battery power. The beacon blinked its weak green light every 30 seconds, my only proof that help might eventually come. Then I heard it, footsteps crunching through the snow above me, slow and deliberate, circling where the truck had gone over. Not the quick, concerned pace of someone who'd just discovered an accident, but measured, patient steps. I grabbed the flashlight, aimed it up toward the road, caught a glimpse of a figure in a heavy brown Carhartt jacket and wool cap pulled low. Male, average height, couldn't make out the face. He stood at the edge, looking down at me, and for a moment I felt relief flooding through me. I started yelling, explaining I was hurt, needed help, had already activated my beacon but needed immediate assistance. The figure didn't respond, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge me at all. Just stood there, hands in pockets, watching. After maybe 2 minutes that felt like 2 hours, he turned and walked away, footsteps fading into the storm. Around midnight the footsteps returned, but this time there were 2 sets. They moved differently than before, one heavy and slow, the other lighter, almost dancing through the snow. They'd stop directly above me, whisper to each other in voices too low to make out words, then move again. Sometimes they'd throw things down, small rocks that pinged off the truck's hood, branches that scratched across the roof, once what sounded like a glass bottle that shattered somewhere in the darkness. They were playing with me. I turned off my flashlight to save battery and to avoid giving them the satisfaction of seeing my fear, sat there in the dark, listening to them move around up there like they had all the time in the world. The worst part was when they'd go silent for 10, 15 minutes, just long enough for me to think they'd left. Then something would hit the truck again. My phone had no signal, hadn't since I'd passed the last cell tower 40 miles back. But I recorded a voice memo explaining everything, uploaded it to the cloud for when I got signal again, or for whoever found my phone if I didn't make it out. At some point, exhaustion and cold started playing tricks with my perception. I'd drift off for a few seconds despite fighting it, then jerk awake thinking I heard the truck doors opening, or feeling like someone was breathing on the back of my neck. But one thing was definitely real. Around 2 in the morning, someone tried the door handle on the passenger side. The doors had auto-locked when the engine died, a safety feature I'd never been more grateful for. The handle jiggled 3 times, patient and testing, then stopped. I held my breath, didn't move, played dead or unconscious. Through the cracked window, I could smell that same cigarette smoke, Marlboro Reds. So close it was like someone was exhaling directly into the cab. Then came a sound I'll never forget, fingernails dragging slowly across the glass, not scratching or tapping, just dragging in these long, deliberate strokes like someone petting an animal. It went on for maybe 30 seconds before stopping. The silence afterward was somehow worse than the sound itself, because I knew they were still there, just inches away, deciding what to do next. My satellite beacon kept blinking its pitiful green light, and I found myself counting the pulses like a prayer, willing rescue to come before these people, whoever they were, decided to escalate from psychological torture to something worse. The breakthrough came around 4:30 in the morning, not from rescue but from pure luck and desperation. I'd been drifting in and out of consciousness, hypothermia starting to take hold despite the thermal blanket, when I heard an engine in the distance. Not search and rescue, wrong sound for a helicopter, but a vehicle on the road above. I grabbed one of the emergency flares, cracked the driver's door just enough to light it, and toss it up toward the road. The red glow illuminated the ravine, and for the first time, I got a clear look at my surroundings. There were more footprints than just the 2 sets I'd heard. At least 4 or 5 different boot patterns, all circling my truck like wolves around wounded prey. But what made bile rise in my throat were the drag marks in the snow, leading from the road to a cluster of trees about 50 feet from my truck. Something human-sized had been dragged there recently, the trail still visible despite the falling snow. The engine sound got closer, and suddenly there was shouting, not in English but in what sounded like Russian or Ukrainian. My tormentors, whoever they were, apparently hadn't expected company. I heard doors slamming, engines starting, vehicles peeling out on the icy road. Then blessed silence except for one voice calling down, asking if anyone was hurt. I yelled back, and within minutes 2 men in hunting gear were making their way down to my truck. They were brothers, Victor and Alexei something or other, heading out for early morning elk hunting when they saw my flare. They took one look at the scene, the footprints, the cigarette butts, the cut toe strap, and exchanged glances that told me they knew exactly what had almost happened. Victor stayed with me, while Alexei drove to where he could get cell signal to call for proper rescue. While we waited, Victor shared a thermos of coffee and told me I was lucky they decided to hunt this particular morning. He said locals had been finding abandoned vehicles on this stretch of road for years, always with cut toe straps, always with signs that someone had been watching, waiting. Some drivers were never found, others turned up miles away, dead from exposure but with injuries that didn't match just getting lost in a storm. The state police wrote them off as accidents, city folks who didn't respect the mountain, but everyone who lived up here knew better. There was a group, he said, maybe 5 or 6 people, who treated that road like their private hunting ground, except they weren't hunting animals. Search and rescue arrived just after sunrise, and I've never been happier to see those orange jackets in my life. They airlifted me out, and I spent 3 days in the hospital in Kalispell getting my ankle pinned back together. The power company put me on permanent disability after that, said the nerve damage in my ankle made it too risky for me to work on mountain roads anymore. Honestly, they didn't need to convince me. I moved to Billings, got a desk job doing logistics for a shipping company, and I haven't been back to Glacier County since. But here's what haunts me. When the state police investigated, they found my truck right where I said it would be, found all the evidence I described, but claimed it was just locals messing with an accident scene after the fact. No investigation, no follow-up, case closed. Victor called me a few weeks later, said they found another abandoned truck on that same stretch of road. Brand new Ford Ranger, tow strap cut, same cigarette butts scattered around. The driver, a geology student from the university, was never found. His beacon had been deliberately damaged, antenna snapped off. Victor said the police didn't even send a detective this time, just filed it as another weather-related disappearance. He told me the locals have a name for that group, call them the Watchers, and everyone knows to travel that road in pairs or not at all. Nobody talks about it openly because half the police force has cousins or brothers-in-law who might be involved, and the other half just doesn't care what happens to outsiders. I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear fingernails on glass. That slow, patient dragging sound that means someone has all the time in the world and knows you don't. My therapist says it's PTSD, and maybe she's right, but I know what I know. There are people out there who've turned isolation into opportunity, who figured out that the right stretch of remote road in a snowstorm is the perfect killing ground. They watch, they wait, they disable your vehicle, and then they enjoy the show while you slowly realize that your accident wasn't an accident at all. The scariest part isn't what they do. It's that they've been doing it for years, and nobody with the power to stop them wants to admit they exist. I check the Montana news sometimes, looking for stories about missing drivers near Glacier County. There's usually 2 or 3 every winter, always on remote roads, always in bad weather, always with their vehicles found damaged in ways that don't quite make sense. The articles never mention cut toe straps or cigarette butts or boot prints that shouldn't be there. But I know the truth, and now you do too. If you ever find yourself driving through northwest Montana in winter, and the locals start acting strange when you mention your route, listen to them. Turn around. Take the long way. Because the Watchers are still out there, and they're very, very patient. People always warn you about driving through Appalachia after dark, but when you've made the trip a dozen times without incident, you start thinking they're just being dramatic. I'd been making quarterly runs from Charlotte to Cincinnati for my medical equipment sales territory since finishing college in 2012, and nothing worse than a speeding ticket had ever happened. That particular October night, heading back south after a successful week of demos, I figured I'd push through instead of stopping at a motel. My daughter's 3rd birthday party was the next morning, and I'd promised her I'd be there when she woke up. Around 11:30, just past the Virginia state line where the mountains get especially dark and cell towers become suggestions rather than guarantees, my front right tire exploded like a shotgun blast. The Ford Explorer jerked hard to the right, and I fought the wheel to keep from careening into the guardrail that separated me from a 100-foot drop into pure blackness. Gravel sprayed as I managed to ease onto the shoulder, heart hammering against my ribs while the ruined tire flopped its final death throes against the asphalt. When I finally stopped and killed the engine, the silence hit me harder than the blowout had. No traffic, no streetlights, just my hazard lights painting the rock face beside me in rhythmic orange pulses. I grabbed my phone from the cup holder and watched it search desperately for a signal that wasn't coming. The nearest town, according to the last sign I'd passed, was 17 miles behind me. I popped the trunk, grabbed the spare and the jack, and got to work by the light of my phone's flashlight, telling myself this was just another minor inconvenience in a long list of minor inconveniences that came with the territory. 20 minutes into wrestling with rusted lug nuts that hadn't been touched since the Explorer rolled off the assembly line, I heard the engine. Not the high whine of a sedan or the rumble of a semi, but the distinctive rattle of an older diesel pickup, the kind where you can hear each piston doing its job. The sound grew louder, echoing off the mountain walls, then began to slow. Relief washed through me as I stood up, wiping grease on my khakis, ready to flag down what I assumed would be a good Samaritan. But the truck didn't pull up beside me or even ahead of me. It stopped about 30 feet back, and then the headlights went dark. Just killed them completely, leaving only my hazards and the dim glow of my phone on the ground to fight against the mountain darkness. Two doors opened and closed with deliberate precision, not slammed, just firmly shut like they were trying not to wake someone. My eyes strained to adjust, making out two shapes moving toward me in the pulsing orange light. One tall and lean, wearing what looked like a baseball cap. The other shorter but broader, built like someone who'd spent years hauling feed bags or working construction. Neither one called out a greeting, didn't ask if I needed help, didn't say a single word. They just kept walking toward me with this measured pace like they'd done this exact thing before and knew precisely how it would go. The tall one had something in his right hand, held low against his leg, and I couldn't tell if it was a tool or something else entirely. "Evening?" I tried, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. "Thanks for stopping, but I've got the spare right here. Should be good in a few minutes." The shorter one let out this small laugh. Not a friendly chuckle, but something that made my mouth go dry. They kept coming, spreading apart now, one moving toward the front of my Explorer, the other circling behind. The tire iron was still in my hand from working on the lug nuts, and I found myself gripping it tighter, the cold metal suddenly feeling both reassuring and pathetically inadequate. The tall one finally spoke, his voice carrying a local drawl thick as molasses. "That's a nice watch you got there. Rolex?" It wasn't. Just a Seiko my wife had given me for our anniversary. But the way he said it, the way his eyes tracked to my wrist and then to the Explorer, to my laptop bag visible through the back window, I understood exactly what this was. The shorter one had positioned himself between me and the driver's door, while his partner stood blocking any path toward the front of the vehicle. They'd done this before, probably dozens of times, picking off travelers on this stretch of mountain highway where screams wouldn't carry and help wouldn't come. "Wallet, phone, watch, whatever's in the vehicle," the tall one said, finally raising what I could now see was a crowbar, tapping it against his palm in a rhythm that matched my hazard lights. "Make this easy on yourself." But something in their eyes, in the way they kept glancing at each other with these little nods and signals, told me that easy wasn't really on the menu tonight. They weren't just here for the robbery. There was something else. Something in the shorter one's expression when he looked at my Explorer, at the child's car seat visible in the back, the stick figure family decal on the rear window. He was calculating, measuring distances, probably figuring out how long it would take to move my vehicle, where they could dump it. "Here's the thing," the shorter one said, pulling out what looked like a folding knife, letting it catch the orange light as he opened it with practiced ease. "Sometimes people report their cars stolen, say they got robbed, make all kinds of trouble for honest folks just trying to make a living. Can't have that." He took a step closer and I could smell cigarettes and something chemical on his clothes. Maybe meth, maybe just industrial cleaner. "So, we're gonna take a little ride together. Make sure you understand the importance of keeping quiet." That's when I knew with absolute certainty that getting in that truck meant never seeing my daughter blow out her birthday candles. The tire iron in my hand suddenly felt like my only chance, and I could see them both tensing, reading my body language just as clearly as I was reading theirs. The tall one moved first, swinging the crowbar in a wide arc meant to catch me in the ribs, but adrenaline had already taken over. I stepped inside his reach and brought the tire iron up hard, catching him under the chin with a crack that sent him stumbling backward into the guardrail. The shorter one lunged with the knife and I felt it slice through my jacket, burning across my left arm. But momentum carried me forward, and I drove my shoulder into his chest, sending us both sprawling onto the gravel. We rolled, fighting for control of the knife, rocks digging into my back, his breath hot and sour in my face. I managed to get my knee up between us and pushed hard, creating enough space to swing the tire iron again. It connected with his wrist and the knife went skittering across the asphalt. Behind me, I could hear the tall one groaning, trying to get back on his feet, spitting what sounded like blood and broken teeth. The shorter one scrambled for his knife, but I was already moving. Pure survival instinct driving me toward the Explorer. I yanked the door open, dove inside, and hit the locks just as the tall one slammed into the passenger window, leaving a bloody smear across the glass. The engine turned over on the first try, thank God, and I threw it in drive even with the ruined tire flopping against the wheel well. The truck was still behind me, blocking a clean escape, so I did the only thing I could think of. I slammed it in reverse and floored it, the Explorer lurching backward on 3 good tires and 1 rim throwing sparks. The impact threw both men diving to either side, and I heard their truck's headlights shatter, the crunch of metal on metal. Then I was spinning the wheel, grinding forward, the rim screaming against asphalt as I pushed the Explorer to move, to get away, to get anywhere but here. They tried to follow. Of course they did. In my rearview mirror, I could see their truck lurching to life, one headlight now dark, weaving as they tried to match my erratic path. But their confidence was shaken, and my desperation gave me an edge. I rode that rim for 3 miles, sparks flying, the whole vehicle shaking like it might come apart, until I saw lights ahead, a 24-hour gas station, bright as heaven, with 2 semis parked outside and a state trooper filling up his cruiser. I practically crashed into the parking lot, horn blaring, blood soaking through my jacket sleeves, screaming for help before I even got the door open. The trooper had his hand on his weapon before he saw my condition, saw the destroyed wheel, the blood on my window, and suddenly everyone was moving, calling for backup, calling for an ambulance. They caught them 40 minutes later, trying to take a back road around a roadblock. Turns out I wasn't their first victim, not even close. The police found personal items from at least 12 other travelers in their truck, wallets and watches and phones, some dating back 2 years. 3 of those people had been reported missing, their vehicles never found. The shorter one, whose name turned out to be Carl Bratton, broke first and told them everything. About the ravine where they'd been dumping cars, about how they'd been working that stretch of highway since his cousin Roy got out of prison. Roy, the tall one, needed reconstructive jaw surgery and faced charges that would keep him locked up for the rest of his life. Carl got 25 years in exchange for his cooperation. They found 2 bodies in that ravine, 2 people who hadn't been as lucky as me, who hadn't fought back fast enough or hard enough. I made it to my daughter's birthday party, arm in a sling, stitches pulling every time I moved. But I was there when she woke up, just like I'd promised. When she asked why I had a bandage, I told her Daddy had gotten a little hurt, but was all better now. The truth was, I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear that diesel engine slowing down behind me. I've changed my route, started flying instead of driving when possible, and I never travel those mountain roads after dark anymore. My wife wanted me to go to therapy, and I did for a while, but talking about it didn't change what I knew in my bones. I'd come within seconds of disappearing forever on that dark highway, of becoming just another missing person case that goes cold after a few months. The Explorer's gone, traded in for something newer, but I kept the tire iron. It sits in my garage now, still dented from where it connected with Roy's jaw. A reminder that sometimes the only thing standing between you and the darkness is your willingness to fight like hell for the morning. Rain doesn't usually sound angry, but that afternoon in the mountains near Breckenridge, it was pounding my Subaru's windshield hard enough to crack glass. Early November, and I'd been driving back from a conference in Denver when I decided to take what Google Maps promised was a scenic shortcut. 26, and convinced I knew better than the locals who'd warned me about storm season, I'd laughed off their concerns about mountain weather. My phone had 1 bar of signal that kept flickering in and out. The engine wouldn't even try to turn over anymore, and the temperature gauge on my dashboard showed it was dropping fast outside. Steam started rising from under the hood, mixing with the rain until I couldn't see 10 feet ahead. When that beat-up Ford pickup pulled up behind me, hazards flashing through the gray curtain of water, I didn't hesitate to roll down my window. He had one of those faces that made you think of old photographs, weathered and somehow timeless. Maybe 40-something with deep-set eyes that caught the dashboard light in a way that made them look almost silver. Said his name was Glenn, worked maintenance for the county, and he'd seen too many folks get stuck on this stretch during storm season to just drive past. His voice had this quality to it, soft but clear, like he was used to talking to spooked animals or scared children. He helped me push the car further onto the shoulder, tied a bright orange flag to the antenna so other drivers would see it, and offered to drive me down to Millbrook, this little nothing of a town about 15 minutes further into the valley, where at least I could wait out the storm somewhere warm. The whole ride down, he kept both hands on the wheel, told me about how these roads used to be mining trails, how his grandfather had worked the copper veins that ran through these mountains before the industry dried up. Millbrook consisted of maybe 12 buildings huddled together like they were trying to stay warm, most of them dark except for a general store with a flickering neon sign that read, "Provisions and Sundries," with half the letters burned out. Glenn pulled up right to the door, even got out in that torrential rain to help me with my backpack, making sure I made it inside before driving off. I wanted to thank him properly, maybe offer him gas money or something, but by the time I turned around after pushing through the door, his taillights were already disappearing into the storm. The store smelled like old coffee and wet wool, and behind the counter sat this woman with gray hair pulled back so tight it stretched her features, watching me like I'd just tracked mud across her clean floor, which I probably had. She introduced herself as Dolores, owned the place for 37 years, she said, and she had that way of talking where every statement sounded like an accusation. When I explained about my car and Glenn giving me a ride, her whole expression shifted, went from suspicious to something I couldn't quite read. She kept asking me to describe him again. What exactly did he look like? What exactly did he say? Even made me repeat the part about his grandfather and the copper mines twice. Then she got real quiet, started organizing things behind the counter that didn't need organizing, and finally said there wasn't anybody named Glenn working maintenance for the county. Hadn't been for years. The way she said it made all the warmth from the heated store suddenly feel insufficient. Before I could ask what she meant, the lights flickered and we heard this sound like thunder, except it kept going, kept building until the windows were rattling in their frames. Dolores grabbed a flashlight from under the counter, her knuckles white around it, and we both went to the window to look out. The rain had turned into something biblical, water rushing down the street like a river had decided to relocate, carrying branches and debris and things I couldn't identify in the dark. Then the real thunder came, and with the lightning flash I saw cars being pushed sideways down what used to be the main road, saw a whole tree floating past like driftwood. Dolores grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks and pulled me away from the window, said we needed to get to the back room, get to higher ground, that this was worse than 1987 and that one killed 3 people. We spent 4 hours in that back room sitting on boxes of canned goods while the building groaned and water seeped under the door, rising inch by inch until it covered our shoes. Dolores had this battery-powered radio, and through the static we heard snippets about flash flood warnings, about roads washing out, about emergency services unable to reach the area until morning. Every time lightning lit up the small window, I could see her staring at me with this expression I couldn't interpret, like she was trying to solve a puzzle that scared her. Around midnight, when the water finally started receding and the rain eased to something merely torrential, she asked me again about Glenn, about whether I was absolutely certain that was the name he gave me. When I said yes, she pulled out this old photo album from a plastic tub, pages water-damaged and yellow, and showed me a picture from 1973, pointing at a man standing next to a county maintenance truck, a man with silver eyes and that same weathered face. His name was Glenn Hartley, she said, and he'd been one of the best workers the county ever had, knew every road and trail in these mountains like they were carved into his memory. Problem was, he'd disappeared during a flood in 1974, him and a woman named Beverly who'd been passing through just like me. They found his truck weeks later buried in mud at the bottom of Sawmill Canyon, but never found either body, and people in town had been telling stories ever since about seeing him during storms, always helping stranded motorists, always disappearing before anyone could pin down exactly where he'd gone. Dolores said she'd never believed those stories, thought they were just mountain folklore, the kind of thing people tell themselves to make sense of tragedies. But here I was, describing him perfectly, down to the way he held the steering wheel and the stories about his grandfather in the mines. Morning came slow and gray, with emergency crews finally making it through on the one road that hadn't completely washed out. They brought news that made everyone in the store go silent, made Dolores grip my shoulder until it hurt. My Subaru had been found 2 miles downstream, wrapped around a concrete culvert with the driver's side completely crushed. Would have killed anyone inside instantly, they said. But that wasn't the part that made people start whispering. Wasn't the part that made the sheriff show up an hour later with his laptop, asking to see the store's security footage. The timestamp on the external camera showed 7:47 p.m., just after dark, and there was Glenn's truck clear as day, him dragging something heavy toward the river, something wrapped in a tarp that left drag marks in the mud. The sheriff kept replaying it, zooming in, trying to make sense of what we were seeing, because the figure doing the dragging had my height, my build, even seemed to be wearing my conference lanyard that was still somehow visible in the grainy footage. They searched the riverbank for 3 days while I stayed in town. First because the roads were impassable, then because the sheriff had questions. Lots of questions. Where exactly had Glenn picked me up? What exactly had we talked about? Did I remember anything unusual about the drive down to town? I kept telling them the same story, kept describing that 20-minute ride in detail. But the more I talked, the more I noticed gaps. Little moments that seemed to skip like a scratched record. I couldn't remember getting out of his truck exactly. Couldn't remember the space between being in the passenger seat and standing at the store's door. The sheriff showed me the footage again and again, that figure in the rain dragging something. And each time I watched it, I felt this crawling sensation in my chest, like my body remembered something my mind wouldn't let me access. On the third day, a volunteer search team found something that changed everything. Made the sheriff stop asking questions and start looking at me different. Half a mile downstream from where they'd found my car, tangled in tree roots along the bank, they pulled out a woman's body that had been in the water for decades, preserved by the cold mountain runoff. She was wearing polyester bell-bottoms and a macrame vest, had a driver's license in her pocket that read, Beverly Marsh, issued in 1974. But here's what nobody could explain. What made even the sheriff's hands unsteady when he showed me the evidence bag. She was wearing my conference badge from Denver, the one with my photo and this year's date, wrapped around her waterlogged neck like she'd grabbed it in the dark and never let go. The badge I thought I'd been wearing in the security footage, the one I couldn't find in my backpack no matter how many times I searched through it. The sheriff finally let me leave after the state police got involved, after they ran every test they could think of and found nothing that made sense. My prints weren't on the badge around Beverly's neck. The security footage was too grainy to prove anything definitively. And 3 witnesses had seen me in the store during the time the video showed someone by the river. They gave me back my belongings, drove me to the nearest rental car agency in the next town over, and suggested strongly that I might want to take a different route home. But before I left, Dolores pulled me aside in the parking lot, pressed something into my palm. An old brass key with a number worn almost smooth. She said it was from Glenn's old locker at the county maintenance depot. Said maybe I should look inside before I tried to make sense of anything. Said sometimes the mountains keep their own kind of records that have nothing to do with what people write down in official reports. I drove to the depot on my way out of town, found the building half collapsed and abandoned for decades according to the dates on the condemned notices. Locker 47 was in the back, rusted but still solid, and inside I found a leather journal wrapped in plastic, pages filled with Glenn's handwriting. The last entry was dated the day before he disappeared, and it described picking up a woman named Beverly whose car had broken down, described the way she'd trusted him immediately, described how he'd thought about all the other women who'd vanished on these mountain roads over the years, women the police never looked for too hard. But the next pages were different. Written in shaky script like someone writing in the dark, they described waking up in cold water, described being pulled by currents but unable to drown, described seeing through eyes that weren't quite his anymore, doing things he couldn't stop. The final entry just said, "The mountains remember everything, and during storms they make us remember too." I left the journal where I found it, drove home without stopping, and I've never taken a mountain road again, especially not during storm season. Especially not when helpful strangers offer rides to anywhere that sounds too good to be true. College was supposed to prepare you for everything, but nobody tells you that 6 months after graduation, you'll be living in your childhood bedroom again, staring at the same posters you hung up in high school. That's where I found myself in early March, scrolling through job listings and feeling like the walls were closing in. My buddy Jason called me up one night, said he needed to get out of town for a few days, clear his head after his engagement fell apart. We settled on a 4-day hike through the Appalachian Trail section in Pennsylvania. Nothing too ambitious, just enough to feel like we were doing something with our lives. I packed my gear that same night, desperate for any excuse to escape the suffocating routine of failed interviews and my parents' worried glances. We started our hike on a Wednesday morning, the kind of crisp spring day that makes you believe everything might actually work out. Jason barely spoke for the first few hours, just walked with that mechanical rhythm people get when they're trying to outrun their thoughts. Around noon, dark clouds started rolling in from the west, and by 3 o'clock, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. Rain started as a drizzle, then turned into sheets of water that soaked through our rain gear within minutes. We were 8 miles from the nearest road, pushing forward on a narrow trail that had turned into a muddy stream. That's when we spotted the shelter through the trees, one of those 3-sided wooden structures the trail maintenance crews build for emergencies. We practically ran for it, our boots making sucking sounds with each step, grateful for any protection from the storm that was turning day into twilight. The shelter was basic but solid, maybe 12 feet deep with a wooden floor raised off the ground and a slanted roof that extended past the open front. Someone had carved initials and dates into the support beams going back decades, and there was a logbook in a plastic bag hanging from a nail. The place smelled like wet wood and something else, something sour that made me wrinkle my nose. Jason dropped his pack and started pulling out his sleeping bag, while I checked the corners with my headlamp, finding old spider webs and mouse droppings, but nothing too concerning. We strung up a clothesline and hung our soaked jackets, then sat on the wooden platform eating cold granola bars and watching the rain turn the trail into a river. By 6 o'clock it was completely dark except for the occasional lightning flash that lit up the forest like a photograph. The temperature kept dropping, and we could see our breath forming clouds in the beam of our headlamps. Around 9, we decided to call it a night since there wasn't much else to do. I set up my sleeping bag on the left side of the shelter while Jason took the right, leaving a gap in the middle where we'd stacked our packs. The rain hammered on the tin roof with a sound like radio static, occasionally punctuated by thunder that seemed to shake the whole structure. I remember lying there in my sleeping bag, listening to the storm and thinking how different this was from my bedroom at home, how the darkness here had weight to it, pressed against the shelter from all sides. Jason was already snoring softly, that deep sleep that comes from emotional exhaustion. I pulled my sleeping bag up to my chin and closed my eyes, letting the white noise of the rain pull me under. Must have been around midnight when something woke me up, though at first I couldn't tell what it was through the fog of sleep and the constant drumming of rain overhead. Then I heard it again, cutting through the rain like it was meant to be heard. A dragging sound, slow and deliberate, like someone pulling a heavy sack across wet leaves. It started somewhere to the left of the shelter and moved steadily along the side wall, scraping and rustling with a rhythm that had nothing to do with wind or falling branches. I held my breath, every muscle in my body going rigid inside the sleeping bag. The dragging stopped right at the corner where the wall met the open front of the shelter, and for maybe 10 seconds there was just the rain. Then came footsteps, or what might have been footsteps, heavy and uneven, squelching in the mud just beyond where I could see. They moved along the front of the shelter, paused, moved again, like someone was examining the entrance. I wanted to wake Jason but couldn't make myself move, couldn't even turn my head to look at him. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it over the storm. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the shelter's opening. I could feel eyes on me, that primitive sensation that makes every hair on your body stand up. Lightning flashed, and for a split second I saw a shape, tall and wrong somehow, but the image burned out before my brain could process what I was looking at. Then came a sound that made my whole body go cold, a wet breathing, ragged and thick, like someone with fluid in their lungs trying to catch their breath. It went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. This horrible wheezing just feet from where we lay. Something scraped against the wooden frame of the entrance, testing it, exploring the edges. Then, without warning, something slammed into the sidewall with enough force to shake dust from the rafters. The whole shelter creaked and groaned. Another impact, this time lower, like someone throwing their shoulder against the boards. Jason jerked awake with a gasp, his headlamp clicking on and swinging wildly around the shelter. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Before I could answer, we heard the dragging sound again, this time moving around to the back wall. Jason grabbed his knife from his pack, a folding blade maybe 4 inches long that looked pathetically small in his shaking hand. We sat there in our sleeping bags, backs pressed against the wall, listening to whatever it was circle the shelter. The scraping sounds moved up the back wall, like someone running their fingers along the wood, searching for weak spots. Then came a different noise, metal on wood, rhythmic and deliberate, prying sounds. Something was working at the boards near the corner, trying to create an opening. We could hear wood splintering, nails groaning under pressure. I grabbed my hiking pole and extended it, holding it like a spear, knowing how useless it would be but needing something in my hands. The prying continued for maybe 5 minutes, patient and methodical, while we sat there barely breathing, waiting for boards to give way. Then everything stopped. No footsteps, no breathing, no scraping. Just rain and our own panicked heartbeats. We stayed frozen like that for another hour, maybe 2, taking turns keeping watch while the other pretended to rest. Neither of us actually slept. Every sound made us jump. Every shadow that moved with the lightning had us gripping our pathetic weapons tighter. When the first gray light of dawn finally filtered through the rain, we could see the damage on the shelter's entrance frame. Deep gouges in the wood, fresh and raw, following the edge where a door would have been if the shelter had one. Splinters hung like teeth from the marks. Jason stood up first, moving carefully to the entrance and peering out into the misty morning. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and we could see maybe 20 feet into the forest. That's when he pointed to something in the mud about 10 feet from the shelter. A backpack torn nearly in half, its contents scattered and soaked. It was bright blue, practically new looking except for the damage. Definitely not something that had been sitting out there for weeks. We packed our gear in record time, neither of us saying what we were both thinking. Jason picked up the torn backpack with a stick, and we could see a name written in marker on the inside flap, Kevin Hartwell. There was a wallet in the side pocket, somehow still intact, with a Pennsylvania driver's license showing a guy who looked about our age, smiling in that awkward DMV way. The photo was dated just 2 months ago. We found more of his stuff scattered in widening circles around the shelter. A water bottle with teeth marks that went clean through the plastic, shreds of what might have been a tent, a boot with the laces still tied. The other boot was nowhere to be found. Jason took photos of everything with his phone, his hands trembling so bad most of them came out blurry. We debated calling for help right then, but we had no signal, and honestly, we just wanted to get away from that place as fast as possible. The trail back was a muddy nightmare, but we practically jogged through it, looking behind us every few seconds, jumping at every snapped twig. It took us 4 hours to reach the parking area where we'd left Jason's car, about half the time it had taken us to hike in. We drove straight to the ranger station in town, our clothes still soaked and covered in mud. The ranger, an older woman with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail, listened to our story with an expression that went from skeptical to concerned as Jason showed her the photos. She made us write out statements while she called it in, and within an hour there were 2 state police cars in the parking lot. They found Kevin Hartwell 3 days later, about a mile from the shelter. I won't describe what condition he was in because, honestly, they didn't tell us much. Just that he'd been out there for at least a week. The official report said he'd gotten lost during the storm and died of exposure, that animals had done the rest. They didn't mention the gouges we'd photographed on the shelter, or explain how his backpack ended up torn apart in front of it, or what had tried to break in while we were inside. They definitely didn't explain what we heard that night. Jason and I don't really talk anymore, not because we had a falling out or anything, but because every conversation eventually circles back to that night, and neither of us wants to go there. He moved to Arizona a few months later, said he needed more sun, but I think he just wanted to get far away from forests and rain. I still live in Pennsylvania, got a job at an accounting firm that's about as far from outdoor adventure as you can get. Sometimes I'll see a missing hiker report on the news and my chest gets tight, wondering if they'll be found the way Kevin was found. I did some research after we got back, spent way too many nights going down rabbit holes about that particular stretch of trail. Turns out there have been 6 disappearances in that area over the past 15 years, all solo hikers, all during or right after bad weather. The bodies they found were always attributed to exposure or wildlife, but the ones they didn't find, well, those just stayed mysteries. Here's what keeps me up at night. Whatever was out there knew exactly what it was doing. The way it circled the shelter, tested for weaknesses, worked at the boards with tools. That wasn't some rabid animal or confused bear. It was intelligent, patient, methodical, and it had been watching Kevin Hartwell for who knows how long before it got him. Maybe it had been watching us too, waiting for one of us to step outside to use the bathroom or check out a noise. The only thing that saved us was staying put until daylight. I've never told anyone this part, but when we were packing up to leave that morning, I found something pressed into the mud right by where I'd been sleeping. A handprint, clear as day, but wrong. The fingers were too long, maybe 8 inches each, and there were only 3 of them plus what might have been a thumb. Jason was already heading down the trail, so I just stared at it for a second, then kicked mud over it and ran after him. Some things you just don't need to share, you know. Some things are better left covered up. The solitude was exactly what I needed. After defending my master's thesis on alpine lichen populations that May, I'd been crashing between university housing and my sister's cramped studio in Portland, sending out PhD applications and feeling like my life had stalled completely. When the Forest Service posted an opening for a week-long data collection assignment at the Cascade Ridge Monitoring Station, I didn't hesitate. The pay was garbage, but it came with field experience hours and a recommendation letter I desperately needed for my applications. More importantly, 7 days alone in the mountains sounded like absolute heaven compared to Emily's snoring and her boyfriend's gaming marathons that lasted until dawn. I loaded my Subaru on a Wednesday afternoon, drove 6 hours northeast into the Cascades, and felt something tight in my chest finally loosen when I reached the trailhead parking lot. Empty except for a rusted pickup that looked like it had been there since the Clinton administration. The hike up took most of Thursday, my pack crammed with sample jars, a week's worth of freeze-dried meals, 2 novels I'd been meaning to read, and probably too much camera gear. The station sat in a small clearing at 7,200 feet. Nothing fancy, just a weathered plywood cabin about 12 by 12 with a corrugated metal roof. Solar panels were bolted to the south-facing wall, and a satellite dish perched on top of a rickety tower made from 2x4s and prayer. Inside was bare bones. Military surplus cot with a musty sleeping bag, propane camping stove, folding table, lockbox containing the research equipment, and a battery backup system that supposedly charged during daylight hours. The Forest Service manual I'd skimmed said the satellite phone was temperamental, only worked if you stood in the exact center of the clearing and held it at a specific angle, but it was meant to be reliable enough for daily check-ins with the ranger station down in the valley. I spent that first evening collecting samples, scraping lichen off granite and logging coordinates, watching the sunset turn the ridgeline into something out of a painting. That night I slept harder than I had in months, the kind of unconscious, dreamless sleep that only comes when the nearest person is over 20 miles away, and there's nothing but wilderness between you and them. Friday and Saturday passed in a comfortable rhythm. Up at dawn, oatmeal and instant coffee on the propane stove, then out to the sampling sites with my GPS unit and collection kit. The work was methodical and peaceful, exactly the kind of mind-numbing routine I needed after months of thesis stress. I'd crouch on the rocks for hours, scraping samples into labeled vials, taking photos, recording notes in my waterproof field book. The weather held, clear skies and temperatures in the low 70s during the day, dropping to the 40s at night. I did my check-ins with the ranger station both mornings, standing in the clearing with the satellite phone held high like some kind of ritual offering to the telecommunications gods. A guy named Vincent, Answered both times, bored and friendly, asking about weather conditions and wildlife sightings. Everything completely routine. On Saturday evening, I allowed myself the luxury of heating extra water for a wash, stripped down in the cabin, and wiped myself clean with a bandana, feeling almost human again. I ate my rehydrated beef stroganoff, watching the stars come out, so many of them without any light pollution, thick as spilled salt across the black sky. Sunday started normal enough, but by mid-morning I noticed the wind picking up, clouds rolling in from the west in dark, heavy formations that made the temperature drop 10 degrees in an hour. I'd checked the forecast before leaving Portland, and it had called for clear weather all week, but mountain conditions change fast and forecasts mean nothing up here. By noon, the first drops were hitting, fat and cold, and I hustled back to the cabin with my sample kit. The storm hit hard around 2 in the afternoon, rain coming down in sheets so thick I could barely see the tree line from the cabin window. Thunder cracked overhead, close enough that I could feel it in my chest, and the whole structure shuddered with each gust of wind. I wasn't particularly worried at first. The cabin was solid enough and I'd weathered plenty of storms during fieldwork, but then around 4, I heard a metallic screech followed by a crash that made me jump. I cracked the door open and saw the satellite dish tower had snapped halfway up, the dish itself dangling by its cables and spinning in the wind. The solar panels were still attached, but one had a spiderweb crack across its surface. I grabbed the satellite phone from the lockbox and stood in the clearing, rain soaking through my jacket in seconds, holding the phone up at every possible angle. Nothing. No signal, no dial tone, just dead air and the screen blinking no satellite connection in accusatory letters. The rational part of my brain tried to stay calm. The storm would pass, probably by morning. Vincent would notice when I missed my Monday check-in and send someone up the trail to investigate. Standard protocol. I had enough food for the rest of the week if I was careful. Plenty of water from the creek nearby, and the propane stove still worked fine. The solar panels were damaged, but the battery backup showed half charge, enough to keep my headlamp and phone powered for days if I was conservative. I went back inside, peeled off my soaked jacket, and tried to focus on my field notes, updating my sample logs by the light of my headlamp as the storm raged outside. But as evening crept in and the cabin grew darker, that rational voice got quieter. I kept thinking about the hike out, 23 miles of narrow trail that crossed 2 ridgelines, and a creek that was probably raging by now with all this rain. Even if the storm cleared, the trail would be a muddy disaster, potentially washed out in sections, and nobody knew I was in trouble yet. Nobody would know until Monday morning at the earliest, and even then, how long would it take them to organize a hike up here to check on me? Monday came with clear skies and an eerie silence, like the mountain was holding its breath. I did my morning routine on autopilot, rationing my oatmeal to make it last longer, boiling creek water since I'd burned through half my purified supply. The battery backup was down to 20%. Tried the satellite phone again, same result, and spent an hour in the clearing turning in slow circles with it held overhead like an idiot, hoping for even a flicker of signal. Nothing. The cracked solar panel was definitely dead, the other one still seemed functional, but the overcast sky meant it was barely charging anything. I busied myself with sample collection, trying to stick to the research schedule, but my mind kept wandering to logistics. If Vincent sent someone up, earliest they could arrive would be Tuesday afternoon, maybe Wednesday if they waited to see if I'd just missed one check-in. I had 4 freeze-dried meals left, maybe 5 if I stretched portions. The propane canister was half full. Water wasn't a problem as long as the creek kept running. I could make it work. I had to make it work. That evening I stood outside the cabin as the sun set, watching shadows stretch across the valley, and for the first time since arriving I felt the weight of how alone I actually was up here. Not peaceful alone, but vulnerable alone. The kind that makes you aware of every sound and movement in the darkening woods. I went to bed early to conserve my headlamp battery, lying in the sleeping bag with my pocket knife open beside me, which felt both ridiculous and necessary. Sleep came in fits and starts, my brain refusing to shut down completely, cycling through worst-case scenarios and probability calculations. Around what must have been 11 or midnight, I was in that shallow half-sleep state when I heard it. An engine. Distant at first, then growing louder, the distinct rumble of a vehicle grinding up a rough road. My eyes snapped open and I lay there perfectly still, heart hammering, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. There was no road up here, not really. Just that old logging track that branched off the main trail about 2 miles down, overgrown and barely passable. I'd seen it on the map, but the Forest Service manual specifically said it was closed, impassable without a high-clearance 4-wheel drive. And even then it was discouraged because of erosion issues. But someone was driving it. The engine sound grew closer, then stopped abruptly, maybe a quarter-mile away based on how the sound carried in the thin mountain air. I waited for voices, for doors slamming, for any indication of who it was or why they were here. Silence. Just the wind moving through the pines and my own breathing, too fast and shallow. I should have gotten up, should have grabbed my headlamp and gone to investigate, called out to whoever it was. Maybe it was a ranger coming to check on me, or another researcher, or some local who knew the back roads and had legitimate business up here. But something kept me pinned to that cot, some animal instinct that said, stay quiet, stay hidden, wait. Minutes stretched out like hours. I heard nothing else, no footsteps, no voices, no engines starting back up. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me under into a fitful, anxious sleep, the kind where you're not sure if you're dreaming or awake. When I opened my eyes again, it was dawn, gray light filtering through the cabin's single window. And for a moment I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, some stress-induced auditory hallucination brought on by isolation and worry. Then I sat up and saw that the cabin door was open. Not wide open, just cracked about 6 inches, letting in a cold draft. I stared at it for a long moment, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. I'd locked that door before bed. I was absolutely certain of it. The simple hook-and-eye latch that I'd fastened because it made me feel marginally safer. But now it hung loose, the door slightly ajar, moving just barely in the morning breeze. I forced myself out of the sleeping bag, legs shaking as I crossed the cabin and pushed the door fully open. The clearing looked normal in the pale morning light, undisturbed, the damaged satellite tower still listing at its broken angle. Then I saw it. A work glove, brown canvas with leather reinforcement on the palm, placed deliberately on top of a flat boulder about 10 feet from the cabin door. Not dropped, not lost, but positioned there with clear intention. Fingers spread slightly like it was waving. I walked toward it slowly, my breath coming in short bursts. And that's when I noticed the footprints. Boot prints, larger than mine, pressed into the soft mud around the clearing from last night's rain. They came from the direction of the logging road, approached the cabin, circled it once, then led back the way they'd come. Whoever it was had walked a complete loop around the structure while I slept inside. They'd touched the door, opened it, could have walked right in if they wanted to. Instead, they'd left the glove and walked away. I grabbed the glove with trembling fingers, turning it over like it might contain some explanation. It was damp from the night air, worn but not ancient, the kind you'd buy at any hardware store. No identifying marks, no monogram, nothing. I looked back at the boot prints, trying to read something in them, some clue about who'd been here and what they wanted. The prints were methodical, evenly spaced, the gait of someone moving with purpose and confidence in the dark. They didn't stumble or waver. Whoever this was knew exactly what they were doing. I followed the tracks to the edge of the clearing where they disappeared into the tree line, heading back toward the old logging road. Part of me wanted to follow them, to track down whoever had invaded my space and demand answers. But a stronger part screamed at me to stay put, to not go into those woods alone and exposed. I went back inside the cabin, locked the door even though the lock now felt meaningless, and dumped the contents of my pack onto the cot. The canister of bear spray I'd brought rolled out, along with my knife, my whistle, the emergency flare the Forest Service required me to carry. I arranged them on the folding table like talismans, objects that might protect me even though logically I knew they were nearly useless against another person who meant harm. The rest of Tuesday passed in a state of hyper-vigilant terror I'd never experienced before. Every crack of a branch, every bird call, Every shift in the wind made my pulse spike. I couldn't focus on samples or field notes. Couldn't think about anything except those boot prints and that glove, and the fact that someone had stood outside the cabin watching me sleep. I tried the satellite phone every hour with increasingly desperate movements, climbing onto the cabin roof at one point to get higher elevation. But the result never changed. By afternoon, I'd made a decision. Staying here was insane. Waiting for rescue meant giving whoever this was more opportunities to come back, and next time, they might not just leave a glove. The trail would be rough after the storm, possibly dangerous in sections, but it was my only option. I'd leave at first light Wednesday, push hard, and try to cover the 23 miles in one brutal day, rather than the leisurely 2-day pace I'd taken coming up. I spent the evening packing, organizing my gear, forcing down a freeze-dried meal I could barely taste. I wedged the folding chair under the door handle as an extra barrier, kept the bear spray in my sleeping bag with me, and lay there in the dark, listening to every sound outside. Sleep came in 20-minute increments, shallow and full of nightmares about footsteps and hands reaching through the doorway. Wednesday morning, I was up before dawn, shoving the last items into my pack by headlamp light, hands moving fast and clumsy with adrenaline. I did one final check of the cabin, made sure I had the GPS unit, water filter, first aid kit, all the essentials. The forest was still dark when I stepped outside, closing the door behind me for the last time. That's when I saw them. Fresh boot prints in the clearing, the same tread pattern as before, except these had been made recently, probably while I was inside packing. They came from the logging road direction again, approached within 15 feet of the cabin door, and then stopped. Just stopped. Like whoever it was had stood there watching the cabin, watching the light from my headlamp moving inside the windows. Then the prints turned and walked away, back into the trees. I didn't wait to analyze them further. I hit the trail at a near run, my overladen pack bouncing painfully against my back, moving as fast as the narrow path and pre-dawn darkness allowed. For the first hour, I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see someone following, but the trail stayed empty. As the sun rose and I put more distance between myself and that clearing, the panic started to shift into something else, a grim determination to just keep moving, keep covering ground, get back to civilization and people and safety. I made it to the trailhead parking lot 13 hours later, legs screaming, feet blistered, completely exhausted but alive. My Subaru was exactly where I'd left it, untouched, and I'd never been so grateful to see that beat-up vehicle in my life. I drove straight to the ranger station, barely coherent as I tried to explain what happened to Vincent and his supervisor. They took it seriously, I'll give them that. Vincent radioed another ranger to hike up and check the cabin, while his supervisor filed an incident report and asked me detailed questions about the vehicle I'd heard, the boot prints, everything. They found the glove where I'd left it on the table inside, bagged it as evidence. The boot prints were still visible, but rain that Wednesday afternoon washed away most of the detail before they could make proper casts. The supervisor told me they'd increase patrols on that old logging road, set up a trail camera near the cabin, and investigate whether any vehicles had been reported in that area. He was kind but honest, said without more evidence, there wasn't much they could do beyond monitoring the situation. I never found out who it was. The Forest Service sent me updates for a few months after, mostly saying the trail camera hadn't captured anything unusual, and no other researchers reported problems at that station. Vincent told me during one phone call that they'd found tire tracks on the logging road that matched a common model of pickup truck, but that described half the vehicles in the county. Eventually, the emails stopped coming and I stopped checking. I finished my field report from the samples I'd collected, got my recommendation letter, and started a PhD program in September at a university in the Midwest, far from any mountains. I threw away the work glove after the Forest Service said they didn't need it anymore. Sometimes I still think about those boot prints circling the cabin, about how close that person got, about what they wanted, or what might have happened if I'd stayed another night. The rational explanations don't satisfy me, never have. Maybe it was a squatter using the logging road, someone who got spooked when they realized the cabin was occupied. Maybe it was a local playing a cruel joke, Or some creep who got off on intimidating women alone in the woods? I don't know. What I do know is that I never went back to that station, turned down every field assignment that involved solo work in isolated locations, and I sleep better now knowing there are neighbors within shouting distance. Some experiences change how you see solitude, and mine taught me that being alone isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it just makes you an easier target. Driving long-haul trucks wasn't what I imagined myself doing when I turned 33. But after the divorce papers were signed in 2017, I needed something that would keep me moving. Hendrick Transport hired me 6 months later, and I've been hauling freight across the Northwest ever since. Most runs blur together after a while. Same stretches of highway, same truck stops, same greasy food. But there's one trip I can't forget, one that changed how I see every rest area, every roadside sign, every dark parking lot off the interstate. It happened on a Wednesday in late November 2022, and I'm only sharing this now because I saw something on the news last week that made my stomach turn. I need to get this out there, even if nobody believes me. I'd been on the road for 9 hours that night, hauling refrigerated produce from Spokane down to Boise. The route was familiar. I'd driven it maybe 30 times before, but an accident near Coeur d'Alene had backed up traffic for almost 2 hours and threw off my whole schedule. By the time I cleared it, my eyes were burning and my back was killing me. I should have pulled over earlier, but I kept pushing, convinced I could make up the time. The sun had been down for hours, and the temperature outside had dropped into the teens. That brutal kind of cold that makes your cab feel like a tin can even with the heat blasting. My fuel gauge sat just above a quarter tank, plenty to reach the next town, but my bladder was telling a different story. That's so when I spotted it through the darkness, a hand-painted wooden sign lit up with yellow bulbs strung around the edges. Rest area, 2 miles, home-cooked meals, open late. The promise of hot food and a bathroom was enough to make me flip my turn signal. The exit came up fast, a narrow turnoff that curved sharply into the trees. No streetlights, just my headlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating the dense pine forest on both sides. The road was rougher than I expected, cracked asphalt that made my trailer bounce and rattle behind me. I downshifted and took it slow, wondering why the state would let a rest area get this run down. Usually these places are maintained pretty well, especially on routes that see heavy truck traffic, but I figured maybe it was one of those unofficial spots. The kind that locals know about but doesn't show up on GPS. I'd seen a few of those over the years. The road curved for maybe half a mile before opening up into a clearing, and that's when I got my first real look at the place. It wasn't what I expected at all. The clearing was bigger than most rest areas, maybe the size of a football field, surrounded on all sides by thick forest. There were no lights except for a single buzzing fluorescent fixture mounted on a wooden pole in the center, casting this sickly yellow glow over everything. I could see 3 other big rigs parked in a loose cluster near the far end, their cabs dark and silent. No idling engines, no lights, nothing. That struck me as odd right away because truckers usually keep their engines running at night for heat, especially in weather this cold. Off to the left was a small wooden building, maybe 20 feet across, with a hand-painted sign that read restrooms and food in that same amateur style as the highway sign. The paint was peeling, and the whole structure looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in years. There was a dim light glowing inside, warm and orange like a kerosene lamp, and I could see condensation on the windows. The whole setup felt wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. I pulled my rig into a spot about 50 feet from the building, keeping some distance between myself and those other trucks. Force of habit, I guess. I set the air brake and killed the engine, instantly regretting it when the cold started seeping in through the door seals. I sat there for a minute just watching. Nobody moved in or around the building. The other trucks stayed dark and silent. I checked my phone, no signal, which wasn't surprising this deep in the mountains. The clock read 11:47 p.m. I grabbed my jacket from behind the seat and my flashlight from the door pocket, one of those heavy mag lights that doubles as a weapon if you need it to. The cold hit me like a wall when I opened the door, that sharp mountain air that stings your lungs. My boots crunched on gravel mixed with patches of frozen snow as I walked toward the building. The fluorescent pole light buzzed louder as I got closer, flickering every few seconds. I could smell something cooking, onions maybe, or some kind of stew. It actually smelled good, which eased my nerves a little bit. The door to the building was solid wood, old and heavy, with a metal handle that was ice cold to the touch. I pulled it open and stepped inside, grateful for the warmth that hit my face. The interior was one room, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with a counter along the back wall and 4 small tables with mismatched chairs scattered around. An older woman stood behind the counter, maybe 60 or 65, with gray hair pulled back in a loose bun. She wore a floral apron over a thick sweater and was stirring something in a large pot on a camping stove. She looked up when I entered and gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Evening, hun," she said, her voice gravelly like a lifetime smoker. "Cold one tonight. You hungry?" I nodded and approached the counter, noticing that the restroom door in the corner had a padlock on it. "Bathroom's out of order," she said quickly, following my gaze. "Pipes burst last week. There's an outhouse around back if you need it." That didn't make sense. If the pipes burst, why was she cooking with water? But I was too tired to question it. I asked what she had to eat and she gestured to the pot. "Beef stew. Made it fresh this afternoon. $8 for a bowl and some bread." The price was reasonable and my stomach was growling, so I pulled out my wallet. That's when I heard it. A sharp metallic sound from outside, like a chain being dragged across gravel. The woman's eyes flickered toward the window behind me for just a split second, before she looked back down at her pot. "That'll be cash only," she said, her voice a little tighter now. I handed her a 10 and she made change from a cigar box under the counter, her movements quick and mechanical. As she ladled stew into a foam bowl, I turned to glance out the window. What I saw made my appetite vanish instantly. 2 men had appeared near my truck, both wearing dark jackets and baseball caps pulled low. One was walking around my rig, shining a flashlight into the cab windows. The other was doing something near my fuel tanks. I couldn't see clearly through the dirty window, but the way they moved, coordinated and deliberate, sent alarm bells screaming in my head. "Those guys friends of yours?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. The woman didn't look up. "Don't know what you mean, hun. Here's your stew." I didn't take the bowl. My brain was working overtime now, piecing things together. The dark trucks with no engines running, the locked bathroom, this woman alone in the middle of nowhere, the way she kept glancing at the door. "Actually, I need to use that outhouse first," I said, backing toward the exit. She finally looked at me, and this time there was something calculating in her expression, like she was deciding something. "Might want to eat while it's hot," she said, but I was already pushing through the door. The cold air hit me again, but I barely noticed. I walked quickly toward my truck, my hand gripping the maglite tight. The 2 men had moved. They were now standing near the other parked rigs, and as I got closer, I could see 3 more figures emerging from behind the trailers. All men, all dressed in dark clothes, all watching me. My rig was about 40 feet away. The exit road was another 100 feet beyond that, and I could see now that someone had parked the old pickup truck sideways across it, blocking the way out. My heart was hammering, but I kept walking, trying to look calm. One of the men started moving toward me, casual at first, then faster. I didn't run. Running would have sealed it. Instead, I picked up my pace just enough to reach my cab door before he closed the distance. I yanked it open and hauled myself up in one motion, slamming the door and hitting the lock. The man reached my truck 2 seconds later, grabbing the handle and pulling hard. He wasn't wearing a mask, and I got a clear look at his face through the window. Mid-40s beard, dead calm expression. He wasn't yelling or threatening. He just stood there pulling the handle rhythmically, like he had all the time in the world. That scared me more than anything. I twisted the key and the engine turned over, thank God, roaring to life. I released the air brake and threw it into gear. The man outside stepped back and pulled something from his jacket. I saw the glint of metal, a tire iron or crowbar. 2 more men were running toward my passenger side now. I had maybe 3 seconds before they surrounded me completely. The pickup blocking the exit was old, A Ford from the 90s by the look of it. I did the math in my head. My rig fully loaded weighed about 35,000 pounds. That truck weighed maybe 4,000. I gunned the engine and aimed straight for it, no hesitation. The men scattered as I picked up speed, 20 miles per hour, then 30. I heard shouting behind me and something metal clanged off my trailer. The pickup grew larger in my headlights. At the last second, I saw someone in the driver's seat scramble out and dive clear. Then I hit it. The impact jolted through my entire body, my seatbelt cutting hard across my chest. The truck's rear end lifted and spun sideways with a screech of tearing metal. My rig bucked and shuddered but kept moving, pushing through. The pickup's bed crumpled like tinfoil, and then I was past it, accelerating hard down the exit road. My mirrors showed chaos behind me. Men running, flashlight beams swinging wildly, someone throwing something that bounced off my doors. Then the trees closed in and they disappeared from view. I drove like hell for 20 minutes straight, not slowing down until I hit the main highway and saw other traffic. My whole body was shaking, adrenaline making my vision swim. I pulled into the first legitimate truck stop I found, a Flying J just outside Lewiston, and parked under the brightest lights I could find. I sat there for a good 10 minutes just breathing, checking my mirrors every few seconds. Then I called 911. The dispatcher took my report and patched me through to Idaho State Police. I told them everything. The fake rest area sign, the blocked exit, the men. They said they'd send units to investigate and took down my information. A trooper called me back 3 hours later while I was still parked at the Flying J, too wired to sleep. He said they'd found the location. The building was abandoned, no woman inside, no camping stove, nothing. Just an empty room with trash on the floor. The pickup I'd rammed was gone. No other trucks in the clearing. He said it looked like someone had swept the gravel to hide tire tracks. They found the fake sign though, already torn down and tossed in the ditch. The trooper told me to file a formal report when I got to Boise, which I did. For weeks I heard nothing. Then, in January, about 6 weeks after it happened, a detective called me. He said they'd connected my incident to a string of disappearances along that corridor. Truckers who'd gone missing over the past 2 years. 4 confirmed cases, maybe more. All independent drivers, the kind without dispatch tracking their every move. They'd found one of the missing trucks stripped and abandoned near the Canadian border. The detective said my report had finally given them enough to start piecing it together. Apparently that rest area had been shut down by the state back in 2012, but someone had been maintaining the fake signs and luring drivers in. They suspected it was an organized crew hitting trucks for cargo and whatever cash the drivers carried. And based on the disappearances, they weren't leaving witnesses. The investigation is still ongoing. Last week I saw a news report that they'd made 3 arrests in connection with the case. When they showed the mugshots, I recognized one face immediately. The man with the beard who'd pulled my door handle, still wearing that same dead calm expression. I still drive for Hendrick, still haul the same routes, but I'm different now. I don't care how badly I need to piss or how hungry I am. I will never pull into an unmarked rest area again. I keep my phone charged, my fuel tank above half, and I trust my gut when something feels wrong. The detective told me I was lucky, that my decision to ram through that barricade probably saved my life. He said most of the missing drivers were found to have stopped their engines and gotten out of their cabs, just like I almost did. Sometimes I think about those other trucks I saw parked in that clearing, dark and silent in the cold. I wonder if the drivers were already gone by the time I arrived, or if they were nearby watching, waiting to see if I'd be stupid enough to stay. I'll never know. What I do know is that comfort and routine can kill you out here. That hand-painted sign looked harmless, almost charming. The woman seemed like somebody's grandmother, but that's exactly how they wanted it to look. I'm sharing this because I want every driver out there to know that this stuff is real. It's not an urban legend or some campfire story. There are people who see trucks as moving ATMs full of cargo and cash, and they're willing to do whatever it takes. Pay attention to the details, trust your instincts, and if something feels even slightly wrong, get the hell out. Those extra miles to a real truck stop might save your life. The Smoky Mountains had always been my favorite place to disappear for a few days. I was working on a photography piece for a small outdoor magazine, trying to capture early spring fog rolling over the ridges. My life back then was simple. I'd drive my old pickup from one national park to another, sleep in the back, and send my editor shots whenever I found something worth keeping. That week had been quiet. Cold mornings, a few deer, and the kind of silence that settles so deep you start hearing your own heartbeat echo inside your head. On my third day, I hiked up to a ridge near Klingman's Dome before sunrise. The fog was thick enough that my flashlight beam looked like it was hitting a wall. I remember the ground being slick, mud clinging to my boots, and that strange burnt wood smell that sometimes lingers after lightning storms. Around 8 a.m., I finally reached an open spot where the trees thinned out, giving me a view of endless gray ridges dissolving into the mist. I set up my tripod, took a few test shots, and felt that familiar calm I only ever got when I was alone in places like this. A little after noon, I took a break and checked my phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising that high up. But I noticed something odd, faint footprints in the mud behind my setup. Not mine. They were deeper, wider, and pointed slightly uphill, like someone had been standing just above me for a while. I brushed it off at first, assuming another hiker had passed earlier, but when I followed the prints with my eyes, they stopped abruptly near a cluster of mossy rocks, as if the person had vanished mid-step. The air around me suddenly felt heavier, quieter, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I kept shooting for another hour, trying to shake it off. Every few minutes I'd turn around, pretending to adjust my gear, just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. At one point I thought I heard movement, a faint crunch of leaves coming from the slope behind me. But the fog made direction useless. I called out, "Hello?" and my own voice came back strange, muffled, like the trees swallowed it whole. That's when I decided to pack up early and head down the ridge. Before I left, I snapped one last picture of the clearing, just because the light looked eerie enough to be interesting. By the time I started descending, the fog had thickened again, and the trail looked unfamiliar. I'd hiked that ridge before, but every turn seemed steeper, narrower, like the mountain was rearranging itself. I checked my GPS, but it wouldn't load. I tried my phone again and got a single flicker of signal, just enough to text my friend Ryan. "Think someone's following me on the ridge." It sent, and then the bars disappeared. I remember staring at the screen for a long second, wondering if I sounded paranoid. But the truth was, I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, matching mine whenever I stopped. I began walking faster, half sliding down the slope, my camera bag slamming against my back. The forest was quiet except for the wind pushing through the branches, but every so often, I'd hear that same sound. Someone taking a step and pausing when I did. I turned more than once, scanning between the trees, trying to catch movement. Nothing. Just the fog shifting, tree trunks stacked like ghosts, and the faint outline of something darker between them that always seemed to vanish when I blinked. At one point, I reached a fallen log and sat for a minute to catch my breath. The air had that damp chill that seeps through your clothes, and I could taste iron, like rain mixed with metal. I glanced downslope and saw something half buried near the base of a tree, a torn piece of blue fabric, maybe from a jacket. I thought it might have been mine from the last trip, but when I picked it up, it was warm, not body warm, but as if someone had been holding it recently. That was the moment I decided to leave the ridge completely and cut across toward the service road, even if it meant bushwhacking through thick brush. The forest got darker much faster than I expected. The light turned that strange blue-gray that happens before dusk, and every sound seemed to stretch. A branch snapping miles away, an owl calling twice. I tripped once, caught myself on a sapling and realized I was standing near a steep drop, maybe 30 feet down. When I looked over the edge, I could just make out my own tripod still standing where I'd left it earlier. I hadn't even noticed I'd circled back to the same spot. That's when the unease hit me hard, like I was being led, not lost. I took a few careful steps back from the edge, trying to steady my breathing. The fog had thinned just enough for me to see faint shapes between the trees, but they never fully came into focus. I wanted to believe it was just shadows, tricks of light, anything rational. But then, from the exact spot where my tripod stood below, I heard the sound of the shutter clicking. Once, then again. Slow, deliberate. My camera was still down there, but it was being used. Whoever had been on the ridge hadn't left. I shouted, half hoping it was another hiker, maybe a ranger messing with my gear, but no one answered. I started down the slope, sliding on the mud, grabbing roots to keep balance. When I reached the bottom, the tripod was on its side. My camera dangled by its strap, lens caked in dirt. I checked the playback screen. The battery was almost dead, but one new photo had been taken after the ones I'd shot earlier. I opened it, and for a second I didn't understand what I was seeing. The picture was angled slightly upward, showing the mist and tree line. And at the bottom edge, out of focus but unmistakable, was a pair of muddy boots standing right behind where I should have been. The woods were dead silent after that. I grabbed the camera, slung it over my shoulder, and bolted toward the service road. I didn't stop until I saw the outline of my truck through the trees, headlights catching in the fog as the automatic lights switched on. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sat there for what felt like an hour before driving back to town. My phone lit up just once with Ryan's text, "Who's following you?" But by then, I didn't want to answer. I didn't even want to look at the message again. That night, I dropped the camera off at my editor's office and told him I was done with the assignment. He called 2 days later saying one of the park rangers had found my tripod and thought I'd gone missing. He sounded confused when I told him I was fine. When I asked about the photo, he hesitated and said there wasn't one on the memory card. It must have been corrupted. I haven't been back to the Smokies since. Every so often, though, when I scroll through old photos, I still pause on that ridge series, half expecting to see those same muddy boots standing just behind me again. I moved up to that cabin about 2 years ago, thinking I'd finally found some peace. It sat near the edge of a small mountain town in northern Colorado, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest grocery store. I worked remotely as a surveyor for a construction firm, so being off the grid wasn't a problem. My only company most nights were my 2 dogs, Murphy and Scout, both mutts, both loud enough to scare off anything that wandered too close. The place had that kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat if you sit still long enough, the kind of silence that used to feel comforting. Used to. That night, or more accurately early morning, I was pulled out of sleep by Murphy's deep growl echoing through the cabin. It was around 3 a.m., and Scout had already jumped down from the couch and planted herself by the sliding glass door that faced the tree line. Their hackles were up, teeth bared toward the dark. I figured maybe a coyote had wandered too close, so I grabbed my flashlight and stepped closer. I didn't open the door, though, just watched through the glass, waiting to see what had them so spooked. Then, clear as day, came this slow whistle from somewhere in the trees. Not random, not casual. It had rhythm, like a tune someone was repeating on purpose. The kind of whistle people use when they want you to know they're there. My first thought was that some drunk hiker had gotten lost, but something about the way it carried through the air didn't sit right. It was deliberate, taunting almost. I stood there barefoot on the cold wood floor, while the sound faded and came back again from a different spot, like whoever it was moving along the tree line. After a minute or two, the dogs went quiet, almost like they were waiting for a command that never came. I stayed there another 10 minutes, flashlight in hand, scanning the dark between the trunks, but there was nothing. No movement, no eye shine, just the forest swallowing that last echo of the whistle. Eventually, I told myself it was probably some local messing around, and I went back to bed, though I didn't really sleep again after that. When daylight came, everything felt smaller and less threatening. I made coffee, fed the dogs, and tried to laugh it off. But when I stepped outside to let them run, something immediately caught my eye near the back porch. Right along the fence line, half buried in the damp dirt, were 3 cigarette butts pressed into the mud. Not old either. The paper wasn't even fully discolored. I crouched down, picked one up between 2 fingers, and nearly dropped it. It was still warm. Someone had been standing there watching the house not long before dawn. I walked the perimeter of the property, checking the snow patches that hadn't melted yet. There were faint footprints, only partial, leading toward the trees but fading before the slope. No tire marks, no trail of ash, nothing that pointed to a vehicle. Just those smudged outlines and the memory of that whistle looping in my head. Murphy kept sniffing around one particular spot by the fence, whining softly like he still smelled whoever had been there. That's when it hit me how close that person had been, less than 20 feet from where I slept. The rest of the day dragged. I couldn't focus on work. I kept glancing at the window every few minutes. Around noon, I decided to set up a motion sensor light facing the woods, the cheap kind you get from the hardware store. I figured if whoever it was came back, I'd at least have a heads up. But as evening settled in, the quiet returned, heavier than usual. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. I kept telling myself it was just nerves, that mountain isolation can mess with your sense of safety. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. That night, I stayed up later than usual, sitting by the window with the lights off, the dogs lying quietly beside me. The moonlight spilled across the clearing, pale and steady, and I thought maybe I'd scared myself for nothing. But around 2:45 a.m., Murphy lifted his head and gave this low, uncertain growl. I held my breath. Then just like the night before, the whistle started again. Same slow, mocking rhythm, but this time closer. It wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It was coming from the other side of the fence. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat there, barely breathing, listening as the sound drifted along the fence like someone pacing slowly behind it. The whistle would stop for a few seconds, then start again, lower and rougher, like whoever it was had a dry throat. Murphy pressed against my leg, trembling, and Scout stood by the door, staring through the glass with her ears flat. I finally grabbed the rifle I kept above the mantel, mostly for bears, and stepped quietly toward the back door. I didn't open it. I just raised the barrel enough to let whoever was out there know I wasn't helpless. The whistling stopped. For maybe 10 seconds, there was nothing but wind moving through the pines. Then came a soft crunch of boots on gravel, slow and deliberate, walking away. I waited until the sound disappeared entirely before flicking on the porch light. The beam stretched just far enough to catch a faint trail of breath in the cold air, human breath, dissipating like smoke, and then it was gone. I stood there for a long time, gun still in my hand, feeling the weight of the silence settle over the cabin again. At sunrise, I went out back with the dogs and checked the ground. The motion light hadn't triggered, but there were clear footprints this time, bigger than mine, heavier, and they circled the fence line like the person had been walking back and forth for hours. I followed them until they disappeared into the woods, where I found a crushed beer can and a torn piece of flannel snagged on a branch. It wasn't much, but it confirmed what I already knew. Someone had been out there watching me, maybe even testing how far they could go before I reacted. I filed a report with the sheriff's office later that morning, but the deputy who came out looked tired, like he'd heard it all before. He said they'd patrol the area and told me to keep my doors locked. That was weeks ago and no one's been caught. I still live in that cabin, but I've stopped sleeping through the night. Every now and then the dogs start growling at the dark, and I find myself staring toward the trees again, waiting for that whistle. It hasn't come back yet, but I keep the porch light on anyway. I used to work as a seasonal park ranger in the Appalachian Highlands, back when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. It was one of those jobs you take because you love the quiet, endless trails, the smell of pine, the sound of wind through the trees that never really stops. The ranger station where I was assigned sat about 2 hours from the nearest town, perched on a slope that overlooked miles of dense forest. The area had a few old landmarks scattered around, mostly abandoned cabins and fire lookouts from the 1960s that no one bothered to maintain anymore. That morning started like any other. I checked weather logs, restocked the first aid kits, and made a note to clear a few fallen branches off one of the hiking routes. Around 10 a.m., the radio crackled with static before dispatch came through. Someone had called in from the lower valley, reporting a column of smoke rising near the ridge where the old Fairpoint Lookout used to stand. That tower had been decommissioned for decades. I'd seen it once, just a rusted frame and a few rotting boards left. Still, I grabbed my pack, told the other ranger on duty, Matt, that I'd check it out, and headed toward the trailhead. The hike took longer than I remembered. The trail was overgrown, roots coiling across the path like veins, and everything smelled damp and old. The air had that kind of stillness that makes you feel like you're walking into a place that doesn't want to be disturbed. About halfway up, I noticed faint boot prints in the mud. They weren't old, the edges were sharp, and the rain from the night before hadn't blurred them. Whoever had been there couldn't have left more than a few hours earlier. I radioed Matt, but the signal cut out almost immediately, which wasn't unusual up there. Still, I remember feeling a small knot of unease in my chest. By the time I reached the lookout clearing, the air had turned heavy and gray. The structure looked like it might collapse under its own weight. Wooden beams splintered, the roof half caved in, metal rails orange with rust. But what caught my eye wasn't the tower itself. It was the thin trail of smoke curling from the chimney of the small ranger's shack beside it. I stopped dead for a moment, listening. No voices, no footsteps. Just that faint hiss of burning wood. The place had no power, no reason for anyone to be there. I remember thinking maybe a hiker had taken shelter overnight, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I approached the shack slowly, calling out a quick, "Hello," just to make sure whoever was inside wouldn't mistake me for an intruder. No response. The door was slightly ajar, and when I pushed it open, the hinges gave a dry groan. Inside, it smelled of smoke and old paper, that thick, musty scent that lingers in forgotten places. A small iron stove in the corner still glowed faintly red, heat rippling above it. Someone had been there recently, maybe within the last hour. There was a tin mug on the counter with a thin film of coffee, still steaming. My heartbeat picked up, not from fear exactly, but from that instinct that tells you something isn't adding up. The interior looked like it had been untouched for decades otherwise. Old ranger gear sat in piles, an outdated radio, waterlogged maps, a cracked lantern. On the desk near the window, I noticed a torn piece of paper weighed down by a rock. It was a single page from a field log, yellowed but clean, not brittle like you'd expect from something left that long. The date at the top stopped me cold. The same day, the same month, but 30 years earlier. I thought it was some kind of prank at first, maybe a coincidence, until I saw the handwriting. The name signed at the bottom was Ranger Ellis Moore. I knew that name. Everyone at the station did. He was the ranger who'd vanished during a storm in the early 1990s while on patrol near this very ridge. I stood there for a long minute, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The handwriting was neat, careful. The kind of script that looked like someone had taken their time. The entry mentioned heavy fog rolling in from the east and a strange light spotted near the tree line. Then it ended abruptly, mid-sentence, like he'd been interrupted. I glanced out the grimy window, half expecting to see someone watching from the woods. The forest outside was still, unnaturally still. Even the birds were quiet. I told myself it was just the altitude playing tricks, that maybe someone was camping illegally and using the place as cover. When I stepped outside, the air felt different, heavier somehow, charged. I walked around the back of the shack and saw a set of fresh boot prints leading away toward the tree line. The strange part was, they didn't match mine or Matt's standard ranger boots. The sole pattern was older, wider, like something from a design I hadn't seen in years. I followed them for maybe 20 feet before they just stopped. The ground ahead was soft enough to leave impressions, but there was nothing. No prints, no drag marks, nothing to show which direction they'd gone. It was like whoever made them had vanished into thin air. I went back to the shack, uneasy now, and tried the radio again. Static. I adjusted the dial, stepped outside, even climbed partway up the lookout ladder. But there was nothing but white noise. It wasn't unusual for the signal to drop this high up, but it felt different this time. Like the interference had a pulse to it. Faint, rhythmic, almost deliberate. I gave up and decided to hike back toward the main trail, figuring I could get a signal once I dropped a few hundred feet in elevation. Before leaving, I took one last look inside. The stove had gone cold already, though it had been hot to the touch less than 10 minutes earlier. As I shut the door, something caught my eye through the gap in the window. A reflection, or what I thought was one. There was a figure standing near the tree line, maybe 30 yards away. I could only make out the outline. Tall, still, like a person standing perfectly straight with their hands at their sides. I blinked and it was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, fatigue from the climb, anything that made sense. Still, I quickened my pace heading down the trail, keeping my flashlight out even though it was only mid-afternoon. The forest felt darker than before, shadows stretching longer than they should have. Halfway down, I started hearing footsteps behind me. Slow, measured, always keeping just enough distance that I couldn't see who or what it was. I called out again, louder this time, but the sound stopped immediately. The woods went silent in a way that makes your ears ring. I forced myself to keep walking, resisting the urge to turn around every few seconds. It felt like hours before I reached the clearing near the base of the ridge, where the old maintenance road began. That's when I finally caught a radio signal. Matt's voice came through, faint but clear enough. "You seen the smoke too?" I stopped in my tracks. "What smoke?" I asked, but he didn't respond right away. After a moment of static, he came back. "It's coming from your location, Tower Ridge. We can see it from here." I turned slowly, looking back up the mountain. Sure enough, a thin gray column was rising straight from the direction of the lookout, thicker now than before, like something big was burning. My heart sank. I'd just been there. There was nothing that could have caused a blaze like that. Without thinking, I started running back up the trail, against every bit of logic I had left. By the time I reached the clearing again, the smoke had thinned out, drifting like mist through the trees. The shack was still there, but the air smelled strange. Not like burning wood, more like heated metal and ozone. The stove was cold, the mug gone from the counter, and the torn log page wasn't on the desk anymore. I stood there breathing hard, sweat and rain mixing on my face, trying to convince myself I hadn't imagined the entire thing. Then I noticed the old radio in the corner had turned on by itself, its tiny red light blinking. Through the static, I heard a man's voice, calm and steady, saying my name once. Just once, before cutting off completely. I didn't stick around to investigate. I practically stumbled down the mountain, barely noticing the cuts on my hands or the branches scraping my arms. When I finally made it back to the station, Matt looked pale. He said the smoke had disappeared a few minutes after I radioed in. I told him what I saw, the prints, the stove, the page, and he just stared at me. Then he walked to the back room, came out with an old folder, and dropped it on the desk. Inside were copies of Ellis Moore's original field reports, including the one written on the same date, 30 years earlier. The last line matched exactly what I'd read in that shack, before it cut off mid-sentence. For the next few days, a team went up there to check the area. They found no recent fire damage, no signs of anyone camping, and no footprints except mine. The shack looked untouched, dust and cobwebs everywhere, as if no one had been inside for years. The radio that had turned on by itself, completely dead. The wiring corroded, battery long gone. Everyone tried to come up with explanations, but none of them made sense. I stopped trying to make sense of it too. Some things in those mountains just don't want to be understood. A few months later, I got transferred to another district. Before I left, I took one last look at the ridge through the station binoculars. The tower was just a silhouette against the morning haze. But as the light shifted, I could have sworn I saw someone standing beside it, still as stone, facing down the valley. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe not. All I know is, every year on that same date, someone reports smoke rising from the old Fairpoint lookout. No one goes up there anymore, not officially. And I've never been back.